So let's talk first about food tech and innovation. Often I think when folks in agriculture think about agricultural innovation, we think about, say, land-grant universities, say where I work here at Purdue, and the investments we make in that. And of course, maybe some of the ones that you all make as a checkoff. I think what we've seen in the data is, unfortunately, those public investments in ag research have really been quite stagnant, and after adjusting for inflation have fallen in real terms. So I think that really raises a question as to what's the future for innovation in this sector. Now, depending on which commodities we're talking about, particularly during the biotech boom, there were a lot of private investments in agriculture that remain strong. But I think one thing is certainly the case, and that is there's a bit of a shift in the focus of a lot of the public research that exists in terms of a focus away from food security and more of a focus on sustainability and quality issues. I think maybe one aspect of innovation that is new, at least has become a bigger part of the scene over the past 6 or 7 years, is the entrance of what you might call venture capital type dollars that have been flowing into food and agriculture. So this group Ag Funder keeps track of investments, again, this kind of venture capital investments in the food and agriculture. And we see some pretty astounding growth that we've seen. And the last time this report was updated was about halfway through last year. So even despite the pandemic, investments in the food and ag tech space remain quite strong. This is just a bit of a breakdown in terms of different sectors of where that money is flowing, but it's really throughout the food sector, although just in terms of dollars, maybe focused a little more on the retail end, consumer end of the marketplace. And maybe to that point, this is, again, that same source here that separated out some of those investments in terms of food, farm, and biotech deals. This will relate a little bit to some of my conversation here in a minute, but if you look at most of these top investments in the food space, at least in 2019, so this data is a little bit old here, almost all of it is alternative protein sector. So this Motif Ingredients, Impossible Foods, and others are really in some ways things that could be quite disruptive for the pork sector. Some of these others on the farm side too are often data companies that may change the way that we communicate across the supply chains. So, when I think about pork in particular, and I think about the kinds of innovations we see in the sector, I think there are all kinds of interesting things out there, some of it private individual companies, some of it more broad, thinking about, say, genetics that can improve quality and flavor, things that can create new product offerings for consumers, either in packaging or even in flavors and styles and the way they're communicated to consumers. I still think I'm still waiting for the day in the pork sector, instead of the chicken sandwich wars, if there can't be something like the pork wars across the fast food chain. If somebody can figure that one out, I think that would be a good demand enhancing kind of innovation. But I think often when we think about innovation in the industry, we're thinking more about things that affect productivity. And there are a variety of technologies that I know are various stages of interest in application, whether it's things like gene editing, some of that for disease protection or other attributes. This technology that's really been remarkable in creating vaccines that we're now taking to protect against COVID, could have some big implications for animal agriculture as well. I don't think we know entirely what that means, but I think it's something to keep an eye on. Artificial intelligence, the ability of cameras to watch movements of animals, translate those movements into data, and use that data to do things like detect illness or changes in productivity or growth, I think are really interesting innovations. And then even throughout the supply chain, things like robotics, as we had some of the challenges last year with packing plant shutdowns and illnesses among workers, I think will motivate further investments in taking labor out of the food supply chain. But I think one really key point I would make, and I think it's one that is a pretty critical one, and that is that as there has become more focus on sustainability, that sustainability is not, in my mind, entirely separate from productivity, that these things are very close cousins of each other. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that innovation and productivity is often the cornerstone of sustainability. So if we can produce the same amount of pork that consumers enjoy, but do it using fewer animals, with less feed, means less greenhouse gases, fewer environmental impacts. I mean, that to me is the definition of sustainability. And I know the Pork Board and others have done a good job trying to articulate and quantify changes and those improvements that we've seen over time in productivity in the industry. So maybe another way to say this is, I think, as I think about innovation in this sector, historically, it's been talked about as following. This is kind of a production function. These are inputs. As we add more inputs, you get more output, more food produced. And the problem with that is there's diminishing returns. We keep adding more inputs. At some point, you're not going to get quite as much as you did out of that last application, that last gallon of water, or that last pound of feed. And that's really the Malthusian concern. You keep adding more and more labor. Over time, the amount of food that each worker produces falls. But what we've seen over time is actually we've been able to produce more food, and how we've been able to do that. Well, we've innovated. We found new technologies. We've better feeding practices, better genetics. Various growth promotants have allowed us to take that same amount of, say, food, water, the same amount of animals, and produce more food. And I think this is often articulated in the sort of argument that we need to produce more food for a growing world population. And while I think that is true, I think it's an argument that maybe has less cachet than it did in the past. There's some people that would argue, actually, we produce enough food right now to feed the world. That largely is true, at least at the moment, not counting the extra billion of people or so that are going to show up in the next 20 years or so. But I don't think the implication is that we don't need innovation. And in fact, you could take these same graphs I drew and say, well, even if you want to accept the premise that we can agree that we have enough food, we don't want more food, I would argue you still want innovation. Because if you can innovate, if we can jump over to this new production function, we can enjoy that same amount of food, but using less water, less fertilizer, less land, fewer hogs. And that's a win in terms of sustainability. So another way to look at this is using data on pork production and prices, is that it's possible to calculate a supply index. And in essence, what this is a marginal cost index. And I've set this relative to January 2020. And you can see this downward sloping trend means that this industry has found a way over the last 20 years to reduce those costs of production. But you do see periods in here where we had high feed prices, for example, back here, where it's not guaranteed that marginal costs are going to fall. But again, overall, the story has been one, I think, of a very, very positive development. So when we think about innovation, though, we got to think about innovation not just within the industry that's making the industry more sustainable and more competitive, but innovation outside the industry that could affect competitiveness. Now, I think traditionally you think about competition for the dinner plate, protein space on the dinner plate. You may be thinking about beef and pork, but increasingly we're seeing the emergence of these alternative products, these alternative plant-based protein products. And I just gave you a few examples here. Of course, again, mentioning, say, here's turkey bacon. It's not as if, this is new to the industry. Of course, there's always been competition there, but what we're seeing are newer alternatives, such as the Beyond Foods, Impossible Foods, that have really made an effort in terms of the food science to try to make products that really do taste much more similar to traditional pork and or beef products. I don't know, for me at least, looking at this picture of this veggie bacon strip, it doesn't look to me like a real bacon strip, but nonetheless, some of these products I think have made some headways, at least relative to the products we saw on the shelves 20 years ago, to be more competitive. So I think the question is, what is this going to do to the pork industry? Is it going to be really disruptive? Is it just going to, be a small blip on the radar? Well, at least some data suggests that at the moment, it's still a very small blip. So these are data from about a year ago, actually. These are grocery store scanner data. And the red bar here are the total sales from the meat department in grocery stores across the US. The green bar, actually, you can't see, it's so small. That's the total sales of the refrigerated meat alternatives. So this dashed line here is basically the share, the quantity share of meat sales that these new refrigerated meat alternatives comprise of total meat sales. And you can still see, as of a year ago, it was about 1/3%. So it's still a very, very small part of the story, but nonetheless, if you look at dollar sales growth, something that does appear to be growing, and I think that's why we've had some attention focused on it. So I want to share just a few insights from some of the research that we've done, and some of these don't necessarily include pork as an alternative, but I think there are still some lessons that are going to be useful here. So this is a consumer study we did just before the onset of COVID, and asked people, if you're presented with these options in front of you, here's a traditional farm-raised beef. Here are 3 different alternatives. One's a lab-grown, one is a pea protein, one is an Impossible Light Burger. What would you choose? Or you could say, I don't want any of these at all. So if you had to guess, what % of consumers do you think chose one of these 3 alternatives versus this one? Well, the answer is about 3/4 of people chose beef. About 12% chose one of those 3 alternatives, and about 20% said if those were the only things available, I wouldn't buy any of them. Now, 12% is still a large share of consumers. It's not nothing. Of course, it's not where the market is right now, and in part it's because this estimate I'm showing you is at current market prices, where a lot of these products are priced at a price premium. But I think one of the key questions is, who are these 12% of consumers, and were they people that would have bought a traditional animal protein to begin with? So we can use our data to try to make some estimates of that. And of this 12%, our estimates suggest that about 43% of those consumers wouldn't have chosen the traditional animal protein beef, anyway. So these are like new entrants to the market. One way to think about it is they're growing the size of the pie in terms of what's considered, a meat product. But there is some substitution going on. About 57% or so of the people that chose this alternative are people that we predict, would have perhaps bought the beef alternative if the prices were right. So there's some of both going on here. And at least this top part tells you in some ways it's a little bit misleading to talk about market shares because the market could be growing. But at the same time, there is some substitution. There is some competitive pressure that is happening here. So again, I think if you look at grocery store scanner data, what you do see is that there is strong sales growth, at least in terms of percentage terms of these plant-based products. But some of that strong percentage growth is coming about because you can get a high percentage change if you start from a really small base. So maybe to give some perspective on whether people's preferences are changing over time, these data come from the Meat Demand Monitor, which is a regular survey that this organization helps support, that Glenn Tonsor runs from Kansas State, and that I also help work with over time. And so every month we survey over 1,000 US food consumers, and we calculate willingness to pay for different products, and we can estimate market share. So one of the questions we ask is a question that looks like this. We ask people to imagine they're going to the grocery store, they're picking a protein item for dinner, what would they choose? And we vary these prices across people. And you can see one of these is a plant-based alternative. You can also see there are a couple of pork options here in the middle. And what you see really over time, really over the last year and a half, despite all the turmoil that we've seen in a lot of food markets, not a lot of change here. This plant-based patty is still only about 3% of the people saying that's the alternative they prefer. You see the pork chop here in the middle that also seems to be fairly steady as well. Now, these calculations are holding prices constant. So you might ask, how is it that grocery stores are reporting strong sales growth when really it looks pretty flat here? I'd say that's 2 things. One, I just mentioned prices. We're holding prices constant in this figure you see here, where plant-based alternatives are bringing down their prices over time, although still at a premium to traditional animal products. The other thing that's happening is just increased availability. There are new products entering the market every day. So in our survey, it just looks like this every month, month in and month out. But when you go in the grocery store, there are more of these alternatives every time you go in, and that's changing the dynamics of the marketplace. Just so you know, we ask a similar question, but instead of in the grocery store, we say, imagine you're out to eat. Now, that might be hard to imagine for some people over the last year and a half as COVID has shut down a lot of eating out places. But nonetheless, conditional upon eating out, what would you choose? And again, we can see the plant-based patty still picking up a very small share of the overall choices out of this roughly, 9 or so options here. Again, you can see here's pork chop, steady demand, maybe a little bit of uptick here towards the end. One thing I think that is interesting, this comes from a more recent study that, again, I've done with Glenn Tonsor, Ted Schroeder, where we ask people's beliefs. What do they think about these alternatives, these plant-based alternatives? Now, this particular question, we asked people, again, all over the United States, just their perceptions of a hamburger versus a plant-based burger, and which one they thought was better or much better on a variety of dimensions. And you can see here, taste. 68% of people said they thought, the beef burger was better or much better than the plant-based burger. Only 12% of people said they thought the plant-based burger was better or much better. So really, these, by the way, don't add up to 100, because there's some people that said, I'm in the middle. They're the same to me. But if you look at across all these dimensions, it's really, the traditional animal protein does better along all of them. Where are they most similar? Maybe not surprisingly along issues like animal welfare and, environmental issues. So, I think one way to interpret this is to say, to the extent animal welfare or environmental issues grow in importance in the mind of the consumer, these products will become increasingly competitive to people.